When Star Trek Strange New Worlds debuted, a lot of us praised it for taking the franchise back to basics and embracing the example of the original Star Trek series. Unfortunately, this year, the creators of Strange New Worlds followed the pattern established by classic Trek a little too closely and produced a lousy third season. Let's break it down and look at what worked and what didn't, episode by episode, and just in case I need to say it, spoilers beyond this point. Hegemony Part 2. This is the conclusion to the Season 2 ending cliffhanger, and as such, there's a lot going on. A bunch of colonists, along with several Enterprise officers, have been taken by the Gorn, the Enterprise itself is damaged, and Admiral April is reluctant to allow Captain Pike to rush back into the fray to save his people, and in sickbay, Nurse Chapel and Spock race to find a cure, or at least a treatment, for Captain Battelle, who has been implanted with Gorn eggs, and when those babies hatch, it ain't gonna be pretty. As is the case with most back halves of two-part episodes, this one is concerned mostly with finding plausible ways of getting the characters out of the holes they were dropped into at the end of Part 1. The Enterprise set portions work the best for me. Spock and Chapel's efforts to save Battelle get a little technical, but the general idea of what they want to do and the consequences of it, Battelle will survive, but she won't be out of the woods as far as Gorn hatchlings tearing her apart, are clear enough. Pelia and Scotty team up to devise solutions to a few problems, and they make a good team. And through it all, Pike's steadfast dedication to his crew and to Battelle shines as brightly as it always has. On the Gorn ship, the captured officers free themselves and work to come up with an escape plan of their own, since they have no idea if the Enterprise or anyone else is on the way to save them or not. The set design for the Gorn ship is good, a cross between a cavern and a gigantic stomach, but the characters benefit from some pretty obvious contrivances, like finding a pile of their weapons, which the Gorn have conveniently discarded. I guess phasers are bad for the digestion. It's also good for them how absent and inattentive the Gorn themselves are for most of this ordeal, but that's a trope lots of Prison Break type episodes lean on. The characters could never do what they need to do if guards were around, so the guards are simply not around. Problem solved. It's not that Hegemony Part 2 is a bad episode. It does a fair enough job of resetting the status quo, leaving our heroes ready for a season of new adventures, while also leaving some of its most pressing problems unresolved to set up tension for the rest of the season. The Gorn are put into hibernation, taking them off the table as recurring antagonists for now, and Battelle is alive and well, but for how long is very much in question. Ortegas is injured in a fight with a Gorn, and the trauma she carries as a result will follow her for the rest of the season. It's a very plot-heavy episode. It's more an act of housekeeping than one of storytelling, but it does what it needs to do and sets up some potentially interesting things for the episodes to come. As to whether or not the show takes advantage of that potential, Wedding Bell Blues. It's a wacky Spock episode, and oh, how I love a good wacky Spock episode. Is this a good wacky Spock episode? Sort of. It's not great, but it's good enough for most of its runtime. Rhys Darby guest stars as an oddball demigod who shows up to serve Spock a wish-granting cocktail that alters reality so that Spock and his ex, Nurse Christine Chapel, are back together and about to get married. The problem? Chapel's new boyfriend, Roger Corby, is on hand, and he's the only one who seems to know that this new reality isn't right. Corby soon opens Spock's eyes to what's going on as well, and now Spock finds himself in the difficult position of living the life he wants with the woman he loves, but knowing that it isn't real. It's a poignant premise that gives Ethan Peck something to chew on as Spock, and there are also some solid laughs from Peck and Killian O'Sullivan as Corby, as Spock and Corby become reluctant allies in their efforts to restore reality to its rightful state. Darby has his moments too, especially when he has to scramble to maintain his illusion when things start to crumble come time for the big Spock-Chapel wedding. The biggest problem with the episode is that it falls apart at the end. Darby's character is ultimately thwarted not by Spock or Corby, but by the arrival of his sternly disapproving father, depicted as a disembodied voice attached to a colorful cloud. If mischievous godlike creature having his fun spoiled by his parents sounds familiar, that's because it's literally the ending of the classic Trek episode The Squire of Gothos. The ending of Wedding Bell Blues is not only a direct lift, it also implies, though declines to state outright, that Rhys Darby's character is, in fact, Trelane, the titular antagonist of Squire of Gothos. The voice of the father of Darby's character is provided by John Delancey, who of course plays Q in TNG, DS9, Voyager, and unfortunately Star Trek Picard. I'm actually fine with that, despite my deep and abiding disdain for fan service and pandering, this thing is just like that thing, forms of quote-unquote world building, because nothing is established about the identity of Delancey's character other than the fact that he is the father of Darby's character. The only thing that implies the character might be Q is the fact that Delancey voices him. But Delancey voicing him could also be nothing more than a playful bit of stunt casting. Do I think Strange New Worlds should be wasting its time confirming long-held, shallow, and uncreative fan theories about the relationship between Trelane and Q? No, I do not. But Wedding Bell Blues doesn't go quite that far, and even if it did, the lazily ripped-off ending is a far more glaring issue. Back on the plus side, this episode introduces us to a couple of new recurring members of the cast. Minor Lucan as Beto Ortegas, younger brother to series regular Erica Ortegas, and Chris Myers as Nurse Dana Gamble. They're both fine additions, but I especially gravitated toward Gamble. He's such a likable young man. And he's not a legacy character or someone's relative, so you can imagine how happy I was to see him. Shuttle to Ken Foree. Batel's Gorn infestation flares up again, and Dr. Mbenga can only think of one possible cure, the Chimera Blossom. The thing is, the only place they can get a Chimera Blossom is on the planet Ken Foree, site of an abandoned Starfleet research facility, and Ken Foree is located in a restricted zone established after the last Federation-Klingon War. Determined to help Batel, Mbenga and Pike sneak onto Ken Foree without authorization, make their way to the abandoned research facility, and discover that the place is full of zombies! And also Klingons. Some Klingons show up, and they aren't happy to find Starfleet people in the restricted zone. What follows is basically a Star Trek-flavored riff on a zombie movie. There are a couple of beats important to larger plots and character arcs mixed in. Mbenga confesses to Pike that the only way to save Batel is to use the Chimera Blossom to permanently hybridize her body with the Gorn DNA inside her, so she'll live, but she'll be part human, part Gorn from now on. And Mbenga also confirms that yes, the death of Klingon diplomat and war criminal Dakra in sickbay last season was no accident. Mbenga killed him. But, he had it coming. Pike struggles with both of these revelations, but comes to peace with them. He offers Mbenga understanding and confidence. He won't tell Starfleet about the whole killing Dakra thing. And though he's hurt that Batel didn't tell him about the hybridization treatment plan, he reassures her that he's going to be by her side no matter what. I love Good Guy Pike. He's one of the best parts of the show, and I like these glimpses into Mbenga's dark side. None of this is particularly outstanding, but it makes for a respectable episode. We're 3 episodes in, and the show has yet to even approach the brilliance it flashed so effortlessly throughout the first 2 seasons, but I'm sure that's coming. I'm sure of it. Some fans react badly to anything grim and gritty in Star Trek, and I get that to a point. Discovery and Picard both had a tendency to lean too far into the misery and angst, but it works better on Strange New Worlds because that's not the default setting. Giving Mbenga something to brood over is fine because not every character on the show is always brooding all of the time. If there's one thing the creators of Strange New Worlds know how to do, it's lighten things up. A space adventure hour. This one also has a lot going on. Not so much in terms of plot, but in terms of overlapping genres and tropes. We've got a holodeck episode. It's a prototype, and La'an has been asked to test it. We've got a murder mystery. That's the holodeck program La'an chooses to play for the test. And we've got a parody of classic Star Trek and some of the people who made it. Those are the big 3, and they combine pretty well. The episode closely follows the general formula for a holodeck show. The holodeck malfunctions, and the only way for those inside to escape is to play the program to its conclusion, while La'an, in character as Private Detective Amelia Moon, focuses on solving the holographic murder. A frazzled and overwhelmed Scotty rushes around trying to keep one step ahead of the escalating malfunctions. That's fun. The murder mystery is all right, and has a clever solution that incorporates the holodeck itself and the holodeck program, and the Star Trek parody around which it revolves gives the cast the chance to play outside their regular characters and ham it up as much as they want, which is a lot of fun. Paul Wesley going full Shatner as the Trek parody's equivalent of Captain Kirk is a hoot, and some of the jokes at the expense of classic Trek's low budget and non-existent grasp of science are good for a giggle. Star Trek has a mixed record when it comes to making fun of itself. Deep Space Nine has a couple of decent gags pointing out the absurdities of the franchise, the existence of self-sealing stem bolts, and the fact that no one seems to know what they're actually used for. But too often, the jokes supposedly at the expense of Star Trek turn out to be secret valentines instead. Hello, Lower Decks. A Space Adventure Hour mostly avoids going soft, at least as far as the jokes go. The actors are vain, ambitious, and clueless. The creator of the show, the Gene Roddenberry stand-in, is an eccentric basket case who goes to pieces upon learning of the studio's plan to fire him. When it comes to getting laughs from the imperfections of classic Trek and the people who made it, the episode doesn't flinch. Where it goes soft is in the earnest bits. While the jokes are fun and all, this Star Trek show doesn't want us to forget that Star Trek is a good thing. So, there's a scene where the talent agent character in the holodeck program, who has the likeness of Uhura, gives an impassioned speech to La'an as Amelia Moon and Spock as Spock about how important The Last Frontier, the Star Trek analog, is, because it uses science fiction and fantasy to inspire people with a vision of a better, brighter, more equitable and just future. And while I, here in the real world, agree with that sentiment, I think Star Trek was and is important and valuable for exactly those reasons, among others. I don't particularly need or want to hear a Star Trek character saying those things about Star Trek in an episode of Star Trek. The funny bits of this episode, when it's spoofing itself, are pretty good and do a decent job of referencing Star Trek stuff, but indirectly, with some separation, so you can see what they're getting at, but they're not just saying, "Remember this?" But that speech by Uhura, or not Uhura, is the creators of the show engaging in a shameless act of self-fellatio. Star Trek is great, I'm right there with you. But I don't need Star Trek telling me how great Star Trek is. If Star Trek Strange New Worlds wants to remind me that Star Trek is great, it needs to show me by being great. Through the Lens of Time, another decent yet unremarkable episode, as decent but unremarkable is apparently the theme of the first half of the season. This one is a sci-fi flavored Indiana Jones riff, as a landing party that includes Roger Corby, Beto Ortegas, who is shooting a documentary about the Enterprise, and Nurse Gamble, along with Spock, Uhura, La'an, and Chapel, explores a mysterious alien temple where the normal laws of time and space don't apply. Oh, also, poor Nurse Gamble gets possessed by an ancient evil and ends up getting killed off. Nice knowing you, kiddo. Good thing I didn't get attached. The plot splits into two parallel tracks eventually, half on the planet in the alien temple, half aboard the Enterprise, following M'Benga's efforts to help the doomed Gamble. Both halves work well enough. The puzzles the landing party needs to solve in the temple in order to survive and ultimately escape are clever and require them to rely on their trust in each other and their imaginations, as well as their powers of deduction and observation. The Gamble M'Benga story proceeds with the inevitability of a setting sun, as M'Benga refuses to give up on his young protege even after it's obvious the poor kid has been completely hollowed out by this evil entity. There's a well-performed but totally out-of-place comedy beat at the end, when Pelia, played by the delightful Carol Kane, speaks up at a staff meeting and tries to comfort M'Benga by telling him that there was nothing more he could have done for Gamble, that Gamble was gone the moment he was possessed, and that the being that possessed him was truly and terrifyingly malevolent. Then, after Pelia finishes her grim monologue, she brightens up and turns to Beto, who is on hand recording the meeting for his documentary, and offers to do another take if he needs it. Kane's comic timing is impeccable, of course, and the bit is very funny when considered in a vacuum, but it's completely wrong for the scene, and undermines the impact of Gamble's death and the gravity of the threat represented by the entity that killed him. It's just a weirdly, wildly miscalculated gag. The Indiana Jones riff is fine. Corby even gets his own version of Indy letting go of the Holy Grail. And despite Pelia's poorly timed irreverence, Gamble's death is as affecting as it could have been given how little we've had a chance to get to know the character. Gamble's sacrifice is not as forced as when Star Trek Discovery killed off Terrarium immediately following a sudden rush of exposition. The characterization of Gamble has been sparse, but a lot more relaxed. It's just a bummer to see a show this bloated with legacy characters introduce a new original character who works, only to knock him off after a handful of appearances. Who's got time for original characters, though? Legacy characters! That's where the money is, see? Take this next episode, for example. The Salat Who Ate Its Tail. Remember that episode of Star Trek The Next Generation where Geordi's younger brother, who is the first officer of a different starship, suddenly becomes the main character for the week, and he spends the episode bossing around a group of TNG regulars who come to his ship to help him out? Well, this Strange New Worlds episode is like that, only... What's that? You don't remember that TNG episode? Because it never happened? Because it would have been super weird and random to turn the entire show over to a recurring character and have the most important moment of character development involve this character instead of one of the regulars, and basically make what feels like a proof of concept reel for a completely different series centered on this character? If TNG had done that, it would have seemed weird, right? That's why backdoor pilots seem weird to us usually. All of a sudden, MacGyver becomes a show all about the Coltons, a family of bounty hunters, and all of a sudden, Different Strokes is about a bunch of girls at a boarding school learning the facts of life from Mrs. Garrett, and all of a sudden, Star Trek was the Gary Seven Show. I guess it's appropriate, though, since Strange New Worlds itself kinda started that way, too. The Season 2 finale of Star Trek Discovery ends not on the actual regulars from the series, but aboard the Enterprise commanded by Captain Pike, with Number 1 and Spock by his side. I remember thinking at the time, this isn't bad, but it feels like a totally different show. And then it became its own totally different show! The problem here is, this episode, the Salat Who Ate Its Tail, isn't testing the waters for a new show. It's a pre-pilot for Star Trek The Original Series, a show that already exists. The only reason the Salat Who Ate Its Tail makes any sense at all is because instead of Geordi's hotshot younger brother, who I just made up, the recurring character the show suddenly finds itself centered on is James Kirk, who longtime Trekkies will know is destined to succeed Captain Pike as commanding officer of the Enterprise. We've seen Kirk on Strange New Worlds before, of course, several times, and I like Paul Wesley's take on Kirk, I really do. Like Ethan Peck's variation on Spock, Wesley has settled into his version of the character and found a way to play him that is both recognizable as Kirk and distinct from what William Shatner and Chris Pine have previously done. He's good. He's a little old for the character he's playing, but that's a minor quibble. He really is quite good. But the justifications for his appearances on the show have grown progressively flimsier until this season he just kind of drops in a few times. Or, in the case of this episode, we just kind of drop in on him, at work as the first officer of the USS Farragut. After the Farragut is seriously damaged and its captain is incapacitated in an attack by a massive planet-killing ship, Kirk assumes command. The Enterprise responds to his distress call, and an all-star, all-legacy characters team of Spock, Uhura, Chapel, and Scotty beams aboard the Farragut to help out. When the Enterprise is swallowed by the enemy ship, Kirk and the 4 characters who coincidentally will be under his command permanently in a few years have to improvise in order to save the day. Like several other shows this season, it's not a bad episode. There's a late revelation about the true nature of the aliens operating the gigantic bad guy ship. It turns out they're not aliens at all, but humans, descendants of the crew of a long-range exploratory vessel that left Earth following World War III and was lost. The ship eventually became a scavenger vessel, haunting the edge of known space, feared even by the Klingons. Kirk learns the truth about his adversaries too late, having already fired the torpedoes that will destroy the scavenger ship. Later, he is shaken, knowing he is responsible for the deaths of thousands of his fellow humans, and troubled by how he lacked empathy for his enemy until he found out they were his own species. Captain Pike reassures Kirk that he did the only thing he could have under the circumstances, but also encourages him to remember the lesson of this incident. Empathy isn't conditional. We aren't that different from our enemies, regardless of what species they may be. That's good shit right there. That's pure, undiluted, classic Star Trek shit, and it's the best part of the episode, and I love it. But why is this a Kirk episode? Why does this series even have Kirk episodes? Kirk's a recurring character. He doesn't even work on the Enterprise. He just kind of shows up every now and then. We all know the real reason he's here, because he's going to be Captain Kirk eventually, but that's not good enough for me. In fact, that makes it worse, because it reveals Kirk's presence on the series for what it is: lazy, fan-servicey prequel writing. Is Paul Wesley's Kirk good? Yes. Do I need an entire episode about how he, Spock, Uhura, Chapel, and Scotty get to know each other years before he takes over as their captain? No, I do not. We're not approaching "here's why the Klingons' foreheads look different" territory yet, but we're getting closer than I ever wanted to. Also, the Enterprise set portion of this episode has a bit where they lose internal communications, and Pelia, who is not only immortal but also a hoarder apparently, improvises a fix by running old-fashioned telephone wire between crucial locations on the ship, so we get the visual of Enterprise crew members talking to each other on the phone while coordinating on a crucial maneuver. It's a solid bit. I like the idea. It works very well with the quirkier, sillier side of the show, which I'm glad it's so eager to embrace. But as with Pelia's "do you need me to do that again" line to Beto in the previous episode, the telephone bit is just out of place here. This is a serious episode, and the characters are stuck in a serious, life-threatening situation. The Enterprise has been swallowed by a giant scavenger vessel. Some of the scavengers themselves have boarded the ship. The tone is heavy and grim. And how are they going to get out of it? By doing something wacky! 2 episodes in a row with good stuff from Pelia that doesn't work in context because of how poorly placed it is. What's with that? Oh, and follow-up question. What is Starfleet? The start of a really rough run of episodes late in this extremely underwhelming season, this one is told in the form of Beto Ortegas' documentary, the one he's been shooting aboard the Enterprise all season. The episode is technically very well done. It convincingly mimics a documentary and manages to use that format to tell a typical Star Trek story in ways that don't seem too obviously contrived. There's a lot of attention to detail and also some strong performances from the cast. What ultimately sinks the episode is how, through Beto, it poses some tough but reasonable and potentially fruitful questions about the nature of Starfleet and the Federation and what sets them apart from their enemies, then declines to engage with those questions in anything remotely resembling a serious or thoughtful way. At the beginning of this doc, Beto asks what makes the Federation different from any other comparable power in the galaxy. Is how the Federation projects its power and imposes its values on its billions of inhabitants really that different from how the Klingons or the Gorn do it? Less violent, less brutal, for sure, but does that make it better? Instead of actually trying to explore these questions in a way that might be challenging to the characters and to the audience, and end up going somewhere philosophically or dramatically satisfying, The episode chickens out by first framing Beto's motivation for asking the questions as selfish and disingenuous. Turns out he's mad at Starfleet for taking his sister away from her family. And second, by asserting that Starfleet and the Federation are ultimately positive and benevolent because the people who serve those institutions, specifically the Enterprise crew in this case, are good people who care about each other. That's like a real-life documentary asking the question, is America truly a free country? And answering it with, yes, because we believe we are free. It's not an honest, useful answer. It's a self-serving cop-out and an expression of moral cowardice, and Star Trek of all shows should be better than that. If you're not prepared to answer the question, don't ask it in the first place. 4.5 Vulcans. Having previously declared my love for wacky Spock episodes, I guess the appropriate response to this one is, be careful what you wish for. The idea is sound enough, comedically speaking, thanks to a very particular set of circumstances. 4 members of the Enterprise command crew, Pike, Uhura, La'an, and Chapel, are given a serum that transforms them into Vulcans, complete with culturally appropriate hairstyles and prefab logical mindsets. This is explained with a single line of dialogue about how the serum is derived from Spock, whose mental discipline is conveyed along with his biological vulcanity. The explanation doesn't really make sense, but it's there. There's a ton of comedic potential in the concept of 4 brand new, technically full-blooded Vulcans calmly bullying and showing up the half-Vulcan, half-human Spock, but unfortunately, that episode doesn't happen. Instead, the bulk of the hour is devoted to following the mostly separate shenanigans of the Vulcanified crew members, who decide, once their mission is complete, to just remain Vulcan permanently, instead of returning to their original human selves. Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with that premise. The idea could have resulted in a funny episode, but the attempted funny business the newly Vulcan crew members get up to is mostly shallow, lazy, and obvious. Vulcan Pike becomes a neat freak, offended by the scent of humans. Vulcan Uhura uses a mind meld to turn kinda sorta boyfriend Beto into a compliant doormat. Vulcan Chapel becomes hyperfixated on her work and formally ends all her friendships with the rest of the crew, and Vulcan La'an acquires the aggressively militant drives of ancient Vulcans and present-day Romulans, and starts secretly working to turn the Enterprise into a warship. Some of this has potential, and there are a few scattered clever bits, but most of it falls flat. There's also an extremely half-baked subplot involving Patton Oswalt as a Vulcan named Doug. His parents were obsessed with human culture. Doug is the ex-boyfriend of Number 1, and when they're around each other, they act like horny teenagers. And that's the entire bit. Oswalt does what he can with this very thin material, but he has maybe 2 significant scenes in the episode proper, neither of which have anything to do with the reason he was called aboard the Enterprise in the first place, and his funniest stuff is in a post-credit scene that he plays with Ethan Peck, where Spock attempts to tutor the eager-to-learn Doug in some of the finer points of human culture. The post-credit scene is legitimately hilarious and a showcase for the comic talents of both actors, but it also underlines how depressingly unfunny most of the actual episode is. And in what is sadly one of the defining patterns of this season, the episode has an ending that plays as awkward and rushed. Spock and the other non-Vulcan members of the crew decide to put Pike, Uhura, Chapel, and La'an in touch with their Katras, their true inner selves, their souls, if you like, to remind them that they are humans, not Vulcans. That's why Doug is on hand, theoretically. He's the Katra expert. But then we jump ahead to a voiceover from Number 1 informing us that 3 of the 4 Vulcanized crew members have decided to switch back, with La'an being the only holdout. Then we see Spock connecting with La'an in a mind meld, where he convinces her to become human again through the power of dance. I honestly don't mind the dancing this season, but they're leaning on it really hard here. And that's it! The main dilemma of the episode is solved almost entirely off screen. Fans and critics have speculated that the writing of the show this season was affected by the writers and actors strikes of 2023, that the show was rushed into production following the settlement of the strikes, and because of that accelerated schedule, there wasn't time to give the scripts the proper attention and fix many of the problems that are evident on screen. Maybe that's it. I have no idea. I'm hesitant to believe that without direct evidence because it feels like a way of letting the creators off the hook for what is fundamentally bad work. I will say I agree that many of this season's episodes play like first drafts, and none feels more like a first draft in dire need of revision than 4.5 Vulcans. Some of my fellow Trek-interested YouTubers and podcasters, especially those who happen to be trans, have harshly criticized this episode as transphobic. And I have to say, having listened to their points of view, I think it's a fair reaction. The episode has a very confused take on whether or not genetics are destiny, and the ultimate solution to the central problem, having the Vulcanified characters revert to their true selves, that is, their biological selves, their species assigned at birth, if you will, can easily be read as a deeply flawed metaphor for a misunderstood version of the trans experience. The transphobia in the episode is probably not the result of hateful intentions on the part of the creators, but rather the result of sloppy, poorly thought out writing. However, the fact that it's indirect and, I think, accidental is not an excuse. I would demand better, dramatically and thematically, from any show, but especially from Star Trek. Terrarium. This one is the most frustrating episode of this very frustrating season, and that's not because it's a bad episode. It's the best episode of the season. And it's not frustrating despite that, it's frustrating because of it. This episode is the dramatic equivalent of watching a baseball game where the pitcher is throwing a shutout only to blow it in the 9th inning. After being pulled through a wormhole in an unstable region of space, Enterprise's ace pilot, Ortegas, crash lands on a hostile moon and finds herself forced to trust the only other form of intelligent life on the planet, a Gorn pilot who has also been stranded there. The episode is mostly an abbreviated riff on the 1980s sci-fi classic Enemy Mine, with a little bit of the Star Trek TOS episode Arena sprinkled in. At least until the end, when that little sprinkle of Arena becomes a bucket of cold water that is needlessly poured over the audience's head. Ortegas makes friends with the Gorn, and they work together to help each other survive the brutal conditions of the moon and to signal the Enterprise for rescue. But when Ortegas' crewmates find her and see the Gorn with her, they instinctively shoot and kill the Gorn. They don't know what Ortegas now knows. They see the Gorn only as enemies, as monsters. It's an effectively heartbreaking, downbeat ending. Or it would be, if that was the ending. Instead, we get an enraged Ortegas screaming to the heavens, demanding an explanation for what's been happening, and then that explanation comes in the form of a Metron. If you've seen that aforementioned TOS episode, Arena, you know that the Metrons are the mysterious and powerful race of beings who pitted Captain Kirk and the Gorn captain against each other there. In the case of Terrarium, it's explained that Ortegas and the Gorn were placed together on this moon so that the Metrons could observe them and see if representatives of two species who had been sworn enemies could learn to work together in friendship. Here's the problem. This episode doesn't need a Metron popping up at the end. It's already clearly a spiritual prequel to Arena, given the human and Gorn stranded on a planet together premise. Making it an explicit prequel to Arena only serves to turn it into an act of misguided fan service. See? It's a new thing that's like that old thing. Not only that, it means the episode passes up a perfectly fine ending to once again directly lift an ending from a classic Star Trek episode, as was also the case with Wedding Bell Blues. Strange New Worlds is already a prequel to TOS. The writers don't need to be making individual episodes that are prequels to specific TOS episodes. And shit, even if they do, which they shouldn't use it as an excuse to skip writing an ending to their fucking episode. Terrarium isn't perfect even before the Metron shows up. Ortegas and the Gorn's friendship comes very quickly and very easily, and there's an awkwardly structured bit in the middle where a ticking clock is established for Ortegas and the Gorn, but instead of getting right to work doing what they need to do, they choose to spend some time playing chess and getting to know each other, then working on solving their life-threatening problem. Seems like the order of those things should be reversed, doesn't it? Despite a few issues like that, Terrarium is a mostly well-structured story. Both the Ortegas Gorn stuff and the scenes set aboard the Enterprise as the crew works on finding and rescuing Ortegas are competently executed in terms of both plot and characterization. Every time we cut from one track of the story to the other, the plot develops in a meaningful way, the tension increases, the stakes are raised. Spock is especially good here, his unflinching logic in the face of overwhelming odds serving as an obstacle to Uhura's increasingly desperate efforts to save Ortegas. It's a mostly satisfying blow-off to Ortegas' season-long character arc of dealing with her Gorn-related PTSD. It's a really strong outing. Until those last few minutes when the writers once again indulge their worst instincts and cheapen a tragic story of unlikely friendship and the deadly consequences of dehumanizing others by turning it into yet another opportunity for lazy, gratuitous fan service. New life and new civilizations. Remember that evil entity that possessed and killed poor Nurse Gamble earlier in the season in the Indiana Jones episode? He's back! Having somehow survived when Scotty beamed him into space, the evil entity used the transporter to reassemble Gamble's body and then flee to another planet where beings like him are worshipped as gods. The Gamble god lures the Enterprise to this planet as part of a scheme to use Gamble's mentor, Dr. Mbenga, to free millions of other evil entities just like him from their eternal imprisonment, which would be bad. Fortunately, it turns out, thanks to her Gorn hybridization and a few other medical procedures she's received in order to save her life throughout the season, Captain Batel is now an evil vanquishing superhero. Unfortunately, in order to vanquish the evil represented by the Gamble god, she'll have to leave her life behind, become a statue, and stand guard in the eternal prison for, eternity, I guess. It's weird. It's Star Trek. I summarized it in a few sentences, but that is a lot of plot and exposition that takes up most of the episode. However, all of that is just the setup for a 10-minute segment of the episode that is among the best work the series has done so far. A poignant and beautiful sequence where Captain Pike and Captain Batel get to live a full and happy life together with marriage and children, and, to their surprise and confusion, no debilitating accident befalling Pike. No beep chair. The sequence is a series of scenes punctuated by mysterious knocks at the door of their home, jumping us through the lives of the Pike Batels, beginning with them celebrating their second wedding anniversary, all the way through Batel's death. First, there's a growing feeling of dread hanging over them in their early years together as they realize Pike's accident is approaching. As the feared moment of his destiny draws closer, Pike turns to Batel and says, wrenchingly, "I didn't expect I'd have this much to live for." But then, Pike returns from the assignment where the accident was meant to happen, and he's okay. It just didn't happen. Eventually, Pike and Batel put it behind them, raise their daughter, and enjoy decades of happiness together, until Pike finally has no choice but to answer that knock on the door. Funnily enough, this sequence reminded me of the movie Excalibur, a movie I do not enjoy, but which I just watched for Late Seating, the movie review podcast I co-host with my best friend and fellow Trekkie Jason Harding. Most of Excalibur I find to be clunky and shallow, but there's one scene near the end where the cardboard cutout characters suddenly come to life and for a few minutes live and breathe and have the power to move me. It's the scene where King Arthur finds Guinevere, his estranged queen, living in a convent years after they split over her affair with Lancelot. They're old, they're filled with regret for how they've treated each other, and as he's about to go, Arthur turns back to Guinevere and tells her about a dream he has. A dream that someday, someplace, maybe in some other life, he won't have to be King Arthur. he'll be able to just be Arthur, her husband. It's the one scene in that entire movie that works for me. And that dream that Arthur describes wanting for himself and Guinevere, that's what Pike and Battelle get for themselves. There's a recurring trope throughout various forms of fantasy fiction of the regular life as the reward, the great hero who just wants to lead the life of an ordinary person and retire quietly and have a family. It's the temptation in The Last Temptation of Christ. It's the happy ending for Superman in Alan Moore and Kurt Swan's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. It's the life King Arthur yearns for. And it's the life Christopher Pike and Marie Battelle get to experience, and which they will always remember. When the dream ends and Pike and Battelle find themselves once again facing off with Gamble God, Battelle uses the happiness and love she experienced during her vision of a long, joyful life with Pike to give her the strength she needs to defeat the evil entity. And truthfully, as someone who enjoys more than my share of superhero shit, I found this hokey. It's the grand statement of noble purpose followed by glowing hands and swirling colors version of a climactic superhero-supervillain confrontation. It didn't impress me. At least there wasn't a big sky beam. Most of the episode is fair to middling, but that Pike-Battelle sequence is outstanding. It's a creative and very emotionally effective way to write Battelle out of the series without killing her off, and it somehow simultaneously relieves and increases Pike's suffering. It makes his approaching fate more tragic by giving him and us a glimpse of a life he won't get to live, but it also imparts some grace to Pike because he did live that life. He remembers it. To him, it really happened, and he'll carry it with him. I wish they'd ended the episode on that last shot of Pike's apron draped across his bar in his quarters. That would have been perfect. So those are some of my episode-by-episode thoughts about this season. Now for some broader conclusions. For most of this third season, Strange New Worlds seems content to coast, as though its creators are uninterested in or incapable of finding a higher gear. On the rare occasions when they do find that higher gear, like Terrarium, they wind up running the car off the road. The ambition, the ability to reinvent familiar tropes and characters, and the willingness to be its own thing rather than merely an appendage to the larger franchise that made the show's first season and most of its second season so compelling are rarely evident. As I was getting ready to watch the final episode last week, I was worried. I mean, put the degree of the worry I felt in context. I was worried about the quality of a TV show. It's not the same thing as the worry I feel about, say, the rapid destruction of my country from within by right-wing extremists. But relatively speaking, I was worried. For its first season, Star Trek Strange New Worlds did not miss. It missed here and there in its second season, but the batting average was still impressively high. But the third season was a long and frustrating slump. And I started to think, have they lost it? Because shows do lose it. Just like athletes, TV shows that start out great or that attain greatness at some point in their run, they can lose it, no matter how great they are. It's happened over and over again throughout the history of television. And once a show loses it, it almost never gets it back. So I'm watching Strange New Worlds this season, and I'm watching a show that used to absolutely kill whenever it did comedy, now tossing out undercooked premises, misplaced, poorly timed bits, and lazy, shallow jokes. I'm watching a show that, while packed with an absurd number of legacy characters, used to prioritize itself and its own original stories over nostalgia bait and pandering fan service, now going out of its way on more than one occasion to make its episodes explicit prequels to episodes of other Star Trek shows. I'm watching a show that previously has proudly and effectively carried on Star Trek's legacy of political and social commentary, now find itself with nothing to say. Or worse yet, accidentally, I assume, saying things that any Star Trek show worth a damn would be mortified by. I'm watching a show that used to nail the ending to almost every episode, blow the ending to multiple episodes in cringeworthy, embarrassing ways. I'm watching all of that throughout this season, and I'm asking myself, have they lost it? Despite how uneven this season was, the show's long-standing strengths can still be seen, though you do have to look a lot harder. It continues to embrace the episodic story of the week format that was once the standard in series television, for the obvious and sensible reason that a television series is presented as a series of individual episodes. But as in its first two seasons, it also remains far and away the best modern Star Trek show when it comes to season-long storytelling. Star Trek's Discovery and Picard both struggled to tell serialized, long-form stories across their seasons, and neither of them ever got it quite right. Prodigy did well balancing serialized elements and standalone episodes once it found its footing, but both of its seasons take a few episodes to get up to speed. Lower Decks eventually devolved into a game of guess which dumb Easter egg this season's mystery villain will turn out to be. But even in this disappointing season, speaking only in terms of season-long storytelling, not necessarily individual episode quality, Strange New Worlds gets this bit right. The Gorn-related PTSD that Ortegas deals with is introduced in the first episode, comes up here and there in a couple of subsequent episodes, then moves front and center and gets paid off in episode 9. Mbenga's mentorship of and eventual grief for Gamble is handled the same way, as is Batel's Gorn infestation and the ongoing efforts to treat and manage it. It's precisely how season-long character and story arcs should be handled. Introduce it, return to it occasionally to advance it a little or just remind us that it's still an ongoing concern, and then, when it's the right time, bring it to the forefront and resolve it. Works every time. Maybe not every time, but a lot. Most of the time. The show also continues to benefit from a fantastic cast of appealing and charismatic actors who have amazing chemistry together. The original characters like Ortegas and Pelia remain standouts, and the show's interpretations of Star Trek legacy characters like Spock, and also Kirk and Scotty, even though I think they're around way too often, remain strong and not overly indebted to previous versions of those characters. And most important for me, at the end of this uneven season, the show mostly sticks the landing. The season finale is far from perfect, but it gets the job done. It doesn't blow it at the last minute. It pulls off that stunning Pike Batel sequence, and through that sequence in particular, it demonstrates that it still remembers how to be the show I fell in love with to begin with. It remembers how to revisit and reinvent familiar Trek tropes. How many times have we seen the character lives an alternate life plot? It's been the basis of some of the most celebrated episodes in the franchise. TNG's The Inner Light, DS9's The Visitor, my personal favorite Star Trek episode ever. And the creators of Strange New Worlds repurpose it to show us Pike and Batel's wonderful life together that they both will and will not get to have. It remembers how to tug at the heartstrings without being obvious and maudlin. It remembers how to break our hearts. And it remembers how to get us to love its heroes, especially Captain Pike, who closes out the season back where he belongs, on the bridge of the Enterprise, facing his destiny with eyes open and head held high, the platonic ideal of a Starfleet captain and the epitome of an action-adventure protagonist. Hopefully the series remembers those things more often in Season 4. I wouldn't say that the Pike Batel sequence in the last episode restored my faith in the show. It wasn't that. It was more like it reminded me that this is still a show worth having faith in. It can still be that show. The show that knocked me over with how good it was in its first season and continued to impress the hell out of me in its second. I'm sure it's a mark of how spoiled I was by the quality of those first two seasons, but if the show could get through Season 4 without testing my faith in it quite as much as it did this year, that would be great. Fingers crossed.